Hi and welcome to this video. My name is Niccolò Talenti. I am a professional landscape photographer based in Italy. And in this video, we're going to see all the different buttons and functions of Tonality Masks panel. The TM panel, the actual version now is version 8.3, but if you have a similar version, that's going to be more or less the same. Every version of the panel will introduce probably some new features, but the main features are all the same. Now, let's start and we will do a complete panoramic of all the different functions. Now, let's leave this first line alone for a moment. We'll see that later, and let's jump right into the Rapid Masks section. Now, the Rapid Mask section will allow me to just select the sky in my photo, the land, the subject. In this case, that won't work because it's a landscape, but if it's nature photography or a portrait photography, no problem, that's going to select your subject. Or if you invert the mask, it's going to select your background. Then there is focus selection, just press OK here, and we'll select all the areas that are in focus of your photo. Of course, this is a landscape with f11 aperture, so everything except the sky is selected now. But also in this case, if you have some bokeh in the background, it's going to select just the focus part. And the edge mask. The edge mask will select all the edges of the elements in your photo. So if you take a closer look, you will see that only the edges are selected. That's very useful, especially when you are playing with sharpening, for example. Now, you have seen now that while I perform one of these selections, the preview is active. And how do I undo the preview and go back to see my image? I just press deselect. Please note, this X here is not a close sign. That's the intersection sign for operation with masks. And we'll cover that in a minute. But now just click deselect and you undo the mask preview and you go back to the original image. Now that's the Rapid Mask section. We'll leave the other line here alone for a minute, just because we're gonna see that at the end of the video, because to use this you have to know what the other functions do. So let's jump here with the color section called Spectrum. In the color section you have the possibility to select just one color to create just the mask you want based on color. Now, for example, let's say I want a selection of the yellows in this photo. I can click on the yellow dot. And so you see only the yellows are selected. But the nice part of Spectrum is that you can combine colors how you want to perform a different mask. For example, let's say I also want the reds in this photo. If I want just a few reds, I can push the red slider midways, for example, and you see we have just added some reds to our selection. And if I push this over to the top, I select all the reds and all the yellows in my photo. But please note, I deselect that for a moment. If I press the yellows on the dot sign, I just tell the panel I want just the yellows, and in fact you see all the other sliders are set to 0. If then I click on the red channel, it will select only the red in the image and push to 0 everything else. So if I want to combine the colors, all I need to do is select one color and then play with the slider. And then this way I can select both reds and yellows. If I want some magentas, for example, I do the same thing. I can push this even to the top and it will also add magentas to my selection. So that's spectrum, and that's very useful because you can play with colors and mix them to create a perfect color mask. Let's now deselect this and let's go to the following section, which is cold and warm. Now, cold and warm, of course, are my tonality masks. That's what TM panel stands for. That's the only panel that allows you to play with tonality masks, which are a very interesting and useful way to work with masks, especially if then we combine those to the classic luminosity masks. Now, let's jump into it. Now, you have cold, which will select all the cold tones in your image, and the warm, which will select only the warm tones in your image. Please note, the cold is not the opposite of warm, because there are many tones in the image that do not belong to any of those two tonalities. So if I just go to the warm mask here and I invert it, of course everything else is selected but the warm. It's just not the same as a cold mask. Okay, that's one important thing to know. So cold tones and warm tones in the image. Let's now deselect this, and here we have the luminosity masks section. Now, with the luminosity mask section, this works like all the other panels out there dealing with the luminosity masks and selection. So we have the lights, lights 1, lights 2, lights 3, lights 4, lights 5. It all goes more selectively into the lights. And we have the darks, darks 1, darks 2, etc. until darks 5. Only the darkest tones of the image are selected. We have the midtones, midtones 1, 2, and 3. There are 3 levels of midtone selection. And then we have these two buttons, lights, which is a harsh selection of just the lights in the photo, which is not the same of lights 1 or lights 5, like you can see, as the selection is very contrasted. It's very harsh. It's a very hard selection. And the same for darks, which is the same but just selects the darks in the photo. Because of course, if you select the dark one, for example, yes, darks are mostly selected, but we also have many dark midtones, for example, in the selection. If I want a harsh selection, a hard selection of the darks, I have to press on darks. Let's call them dark 0 and light 0. In this case, I will also make a point here of the midtones mask, because there is no midtone 0 mask for a very simple reason. I deselect that now. You may have noticed that all the different tabs and windows in Photoshop have this little icon of 4 lines, which are the options. And if I enter the options of the TM panel, I can go to the Smart Mid Mask menu and enable or disable it. If I enable it, I have just the midtones 0 mask available. Okay, and so that means it's probably a mask that I will have to refine in the second moment. But if I prefer to work with the classic midtones 1, 2, and 3, I just press the options, Smart Mid Mask disabled, and I go back with the 3 midtones options. There are other customization options. We will see that later. Now we go through this section, and this section basically is I have created a mask, but I want to do something with it. So what should I do with the mask? First of all, I press now a light 1 luminosity mask, for example. And then there is a big blue button sign, Refine. That's very important. It's very highlighted in blue because it's an important button. And this one will allow me to refine the mask. So if I click on Refine, I take here the levels adjustment on the mask preview. And so I can make this mask more selected toward the highlights and less selected towards the darks. And this way I have a more contrasting mask that I can maybe use for a specific adjustment. I can press OK, and the mask is updated. Now, if you have seen that I click on Refine and I have the levels adjustment. But if you prefer, you can go back to our options, Refine mode, and you can choose Curves or Levels. So if I press Curves, that way the panel is set to refine the mask with a curves adjustment. But I can do basically the same things I did with the levels, but if you prefer to use curves instead of levels, you can do this. Let's go back and set it to levels, which is the way I prefer it. Now, that's the refine button. What about the others? Well, let's jump into a light one mask again, just for example. I can decide to contract this selection by a few pixels, or I can choose to expand the mask, the selection, for a few pixels. Okay, that's not like pressing a light 1, light 2, light 3, etc. That's a different mask. This is a way to contract or expand by a few pixels the selected mask. Now, if I want to load this mask as a selection, I can press Mask Select. Now, the mask I had in preview is now an active selection. The TM panel here shows me with this rectangular marching hand sign that the mask is active as a selection. If I want to see the selection, I can press Show Hide, and that will show my marching ants on the photo. If I want to hide again, Show Hide, and the mask is still active. If I deselect, now the selection is gone and no more selection active. Now, you have seen that if I press light 1 and a mask select, the matching ants disappear immediately. But if they don't, well, you have to go back to the Option tab, Selection Auto Hide, and disable or enable it. So if I leave it disabled, I press light 1 luminosity mask, mask select, and the marching ants are visible. So that depends. If you prefer to make the marching ants disappear immediately when you have an active selection, no problem. You don't have to press Show Hide every single time. You just go to the Option tab and leave the Selection Auto Hide enabled. That's it. So you just press light 1, you mask select, and the matching ants are gone, but the selection is active. Let's go back now to some other button here. Light 1 mask, for example, light 2 mask, for example, here. I can invert this mask, which is not, of course, the same of a dark 2 mask. It's very different. Well, a light 1, if I invert it, of course, is the same of a dark 1 mask, but then it's totally different. If I press, for example, light 5 and I invert it, I have a good mask of everything in the photo except the brightest lights of the image. So that's very different, of course, than a dark 5. So that's the invert sign. And the invert is also available for selections. If I do a random selections here, for example, and I invert it, of course, that inverts the active selection as well. And I can show it hide or deselect as well. So one last button, which is very important, is the Apply button. Let's say, for example, I have a new layer here, and I want to apply a luminosity mask or a tonality mask as a layer mask. Let's say I want to put a warm mask on this level. I just press warm and then apply. This way I have the mask, as you can see, applied as a layer mask to my layer selected. If I want to apply another mask to this other layer here, I just select it. I want, for example, a light 2 mask. Maybe I want to refine it. So I do a quick refine. and I apply it. And that refined mask is also applied as a layer mask to my selected layer. Another way you can refine a mask is also by these 4 buttons here. Let's make an example with a light one mask. Let's refine this with a brush. So I have a white brush, or if I press X, a black brush, where I can just erase some parts of the selection or include with the white some part of the selection. That's just freehand refining on the mask. But I can also refine it with a gradient tool. So for example, I can select gradient here, and that will cover all my mask, of course, okay, as an overlay gradient. I can also, let's press a light one again, dodge and burn the mask. For example, let's say I want to dodge this part here and make these whites more selected. That's the dodge of the mask. So I'm actually refining the mask with the dodge tool. But I want to deselect some darks here, so I press the burn tool here, and it will allow me to burn these darks. But if I go to the whites, you see the whites are more protected. Now I am doing it with a 100% exposure just to make it clear, but that's how you dodge and burn a mask to refine it, which is not, of course, the same to dodge and burn the image with a mask, and that's what we're going to see in a few minutes. Now we deselect it and we go on to the next section. The next section are all my adjustment layer. For example, the most used, of course, are levels, which will create a level adjustment for me with a white mask, or a curves adjustment, or a hue saturation adjustment, for example, or all the others adjustments. You have seen there is a white mask, and the reason there is a white mask is because I have just pressed the adjustment icon. But if I have, for example, a warm tonality selection active here, and I press curves, now the curves are with my warm mask. And actually, the layer itself, it's called now curves warm. That means I have a warm mask applied to a curve adjustment. And what I do here with the curves, of course, it only affects the warm tones of the image. That's very useful, of course, to just apply the mask, not just to a layer with apply, but to an adjustment layer as well. So now let's go on and let's see the final row of buttons here. And the final row is another destination for my masks, and that's the dodge and burn part of the panel. So let's say I want to dodge those warm tones here. I can do a warm mask and just apply it, for example, to an overlay layer. That means I have a dodge and burn overlay layer with a warm mask. So the blending mode is automatically set to overlay blend mode. So I don't have to do anything, just choose the mask that I want and click on the kind of layer that I want, overlay for example. And then with my brush, I can just dodge all these warm tones, for example. If I want to do, for example, a burn layer with soft light blending mode, that's very easy. I go, for example, to the Dark 5 luminosity mask, I press soft light, and all it does, it creates a blank layer with my Dark 5 luminosity mask applied. And it renames the layer Dodge and Burn Soft Light Dark 5. It's very clear. So I can press with my black brush and go and burn those shadows. Okay, so that's very useful. Now we have done a complete overview of the panel, let's see the last parts that we didn't see before. And the last parts we didn't see before are just the save and load, the operations with masks, and the picker here. Now, let's start with the picker. I've saved this for last because basically this allows you to choose a mask but with the picker. For example, luminosity, I set the pick to luminosity and I use the picker to select, for example, this area of luminosity. I press OK and it selects it. Now, but what you have to understand is that it just created a Light 5 mask. It's not different. If I went to my Light 5 mask, I had the same exact selection. That's why this picker here doesn't invent any mask that is not in the panel. It just allows you to choose directly from the image the mask that the panel has to create. For example, if it's set to luminosity again, I pick it here, and of course it's gonna be a dark 5 because it's very dark tone. If I go instead to tonality and I select the picker and I go here, of course it will select a warm mask, okay? And it's automatically going to the warm mask. If I set it to saturation or vibrance, it's the same. I go here, I go to this very saturated color, for example, and it will use spectrum to select that exact color. And it has many yellows, some reds, and some greens, for example. Okay, so it allows me to use the picker to select the color with spectrum. Then the first row here is the save and load, which allows me to save and load some selection, for example. Let's say I have a warm mask and I have just refined it like this, and I want to save it for future use, for example. I just press save. I put the name here, let's say warm mask edit. Okay. Then when I deselect, I go back to my RGB image preview, and now I can load that mask whenever I want. So I go to load, and I have here, well, of course, the classic red, green, and blue channels, but I do have the warm mask edit. So I just click on it, done, and I can reload a mask that I have saved before. Then here we have operations with masks, and that's very useful and very quick. For example, let's say I want a light 3 mask, a light 4 mask, for example, but I also want all the cold tones in this mask, like this. So I can press plus to add the cold tones. Okay, so now I have, as you see here, a light 4 plus cold mask. The two masks are combined, added together. Instead, if I want to remove some part from a certain selection, it's very easy. Let's say I want the warm tones, but I want the warm tones of my foreground alone and not from the sky. So I just press minus sky. That way, I have a mask of warm tones minus sky. That means I have all the warm tones, but not the ones in the sky. And then here, lastly, if I deselect, that's the intersection sign here, which is very useful because the intersection is two masks combined in one mask that includes just the parts that are in common between the two masks. For example, let's say I want now the cold tones of the image, but I want them just in the sky and not the ones down here. No problem. I can intersect that with a sky mask, and that will allow me to create called intersect sky mask. That means a mask that includes just the pixels that are cold and in the sky, combined, okay? So that's the intersection. Now we deselect and we have just finished the panoramic overview of all the different functions and buttons of the TM panel. I hope you now want to try Tonality Masks panel, and don't forget that you can contact me privately by email to ask a discount code for the panel and for all the other plugins that are on the Tonality Masks website. So thank you guys for watching, and I hope you all have a great day. Bye.